Despite all the research and the progress that's taken place over the last 100 years, we still hear so many stories of really bad parasite problems in livestock across Australia. The cost of worms to the Australian sheep industry is $665 million each year, as calculated by Meat and Livestock Australia. And the cost to the cattle producers is more than $100 million per year. Now, their economic figures, they don't really tell you, the other aspects, the animal health aspects of worm infections that are affecting our animals. The biggest impact is really in productivity. So most of the disease that we see due to worms isn't obvious. We're not actually seeing outside signs. We're not seeing scours, we're not seeing anemia, but the animal's ability to grow, produce wool, produce milk, and look after themselves is severely compromised. When you're seeing clinical signs of disease, the animal is so badly compromised that it may take a long time for it to get better. What we want to do is be able to look over the horizon and pick up the early signs before they become manifest as physical signs in the animals. A lot of people look at their animals and think, what sort of worms are in the animals? And that's it, that's 100% of what they think about. Whereas people who've got a bit more education about worm control are looking at the animals, sure, but they're also looking at the pastures and think, how can we best control the worms on the pastures to decrease the risk to animals before the worm problems even begin? Looking back in history, we have had worm control programs that were essentially based on the calendar, and a lot of people are still doing this, unfortunately. Now, we have to rewrite this chapter. So calendar-based worm control programs, you can pretty much say, are gone. And the reason is because A, they don't work very well, and B, they actually drive resistance very rapidly. And so the less you actually drench, the better outcome you're going to have for sustainability. Now, of course, it's still necessary to drench on most properties, but you really want to be targeting the drenches for when they're going to have the most benefit. So instead of having a trigger for drenching, like, oh, I noticed the animals were scouring or it's that time of year, work out your own algorithm, which is a combination of factors: animal factors, worm egg counts, climatic factors, the amount of pressure on the pasture. I'd start off by doing a worm egg count and finding out what type of worms and what levels of worms there are in each mob. And then to back that up, you can start doing drench checks. So each time you drench, you can do a worm egg count 14 days later, and that way you'll know exactly how well that drench has worked, not overall, but against each individual species of worm that you've got on the property. And work out if there really is a need for drenching, because if you can get away with not drenching and instead substitute supplementation or a change of paddock or some other way of getting animals through without drenching, you'll decrease the amount of resistance. About 15 years ago, the Australian industries started up the Worm Boss program, and that's now evolved into Paraboss, and that provides information for sheep, goat and cattle producers about how to get best parasite control specific for their own farm. The other thing that Worm Boss has is directions for doing your own drench resistance test. So I know that a lot of veterinarians will carry this out for you. Some rural stores will do it. The second thing, and this is probably very manageable for small producers, is what's called targeted selective treatment. And targeted selective treatment means you go through a mob of sheep, for example, and you decide which ones need a drench, which ones don't. For example, 100 sheep in the race, you can actually assess them by body condition score, by using change of weight from an electronic ear tag, and you can draft them and decide which sheep you need to drench and which ones will be okay without a drench. One feature of modern livestock production is it's very intensive, it's high production, and that drives high stocking rates. High stocking rates are good for productivity up to a certain extent, but they also drive high worm burden. The critical thing for grazing ruminants is that they're not exposed to huge numbers of worms on the pasture. The easiest way of doing that is to use rotational grazing. So you move the animals from one paddock to the other, which means that the paddock that's become contaminated, we see an exponential decay curve. We see all the worms decreasing at a predictable rate depending on the temperature, and they eventually die out on that paddock. Now, that may not match your nutritional needs, the energy demands of the animals, the agronomic requirements of the paddocks, but it's an important consideration. This is a perfect example of rotational grazing. They're running 140 head of wilty poles on 25 acres. But what they have done is divide the pastures, both using set fencing and electric fencing. And they're able to keep the animals in good condition. They've always got plenty of nutrition and with low worm burdens. They both test, and they only drench twice a year, which is pretty remarkable. It's a great achievement. The most important thing is the low contamination pastures. And the second one is nutrition. By improving nutrition, you're always going to increase their ability to have immunity against worms. For this part of Australia, southern New South Wales, a constant threat is Barber's poleworm, for sheep and goats especially, and it's a killer. It will very rapidly kill large numbers of sheep and goats. So it's something we need to be aware of, particularly when we're having warm, wet weather, which has been a feature of the last 5 summers. Another constant worm is brown stomach worm and black scour worms, and we call them together the scour worms. They're the ones that cause dags and predispose animals to fly strike, but they also are constantly nagging away at animals' growth rates and stopping them from getting to either sale condition or body condition score for reproduction. In cattle, we've got the same worms there, but we've also got another one called Couperia. That's a small intestinal worm, and it's a constant problem because it breeds very quickly. It's got a high reproductive rate, and so most of cattle paddocks are contaminated with it, and that mostly affects growth rates of younger cattle. We've been very fortunate in the last 30 years to have the best products ever invented for cattle worms, and they're called the mectins. We've had that for 30 years, and we've just realised in the last few years that those mectin products have started to fail. They're not killing all the worms. Now, this is a big wake-up call for us because a lot of producers are simply just continuing to do the same things as they've done for the last 30 years because they've had good results. The first thing I'd urge cattle producers to do is test. Test to know when the animals need a drench for starters, and also test after the drench to check that that particular product is working. In general, combination products are going to work better than products that have only got one active ingredient. General advice for sheep producers is to have a better understanding of the worm life cycle so that they can predict when the worms are going to be bad. Now, on top of that, they can do regular monitoring, testing of their animals' dung samples to work out the worm egg counts and also know what worm species are there. And that'll give them an indication of whether the animals need extra feed or change of paddock, or maybe even need a drench. In terms of set drenching, there's probably 2 times when you can justify set drenching. The first one is a weaning drench. Almost all lambs have got a need for a drench when they're weaned. Some people may not do that, and good luck to them if they can get away with it by looking at nutrition or putting lambs onto low worm burden pastures. That's great. The second one is a pre-lambing drench, and the reason for this is because ewes prior to lambing have got huge metabolic demands, and particularly we're talking about ewes carrying twins. In fact, they can't eat enough to meet the energy demands that they have from pregnancy and lactation. And so it's very important that they are able to go into the last little bit of pregnancy and lactation without any worms, because there's this phenomenon called PPRR, which many people are already familiar with, periparturient relaxation of resistance, which means that because the ewes are prioritising reproduction and looking after their babies, they're not prioritising immunity against worms, and so their worm burdens increase dramatically, and the worms that are inside them also lay more eggs, and so you get terrible contamination of almost every lambing paddock. Goats are a very different animal from a sheep, and we can't just treat goats as sheep with a personality. Goats have developed a physiology that's adapted to browsing, and they're happiest when they're putting their head up, nibbling on trees, shrubs, and getting their food far away from the ground. And because of that, when we make them eat off the ground, they pick up very large worm burdens, and that can often be fatal. The best thing that people can do with goats is not just set stock them, and this is very difficult on small farms, but rotating goats around paddocks is a great way of offsetting the worm burdens that they're going to pick up. Set stocking is very dangerous for goats. Worm Boss is a really user-friendly way of learning about both things to solve your current problem and also general education about worms and parasite control in livestock. Local vets are also a fantastic resource. They've got skills in diagnosis. Local land services are a great local resource because they understand local conditions and they're able to respond very quickly to things that happen in a particular region. I've been very blessed in my career. I've worked with a lot of farmers who've been really inspirational and have contributed a lot to the quality of my life, and also worked with a lot of parasitologists who've done the same. So it's great to be able to give back in some way, but the challenges that they face are greater now than ever before. We need to have a different focus for worm control than we have in the last 30 years. What we're trying to create is a robust industry. We want every farm to be bulletproof, to actually have a high degree of resilience so that if something bad happens, they can bounce back very quickly. And not only that, they can predict the critical times, have a contingency to ward off the high risk times.